Welcome everyone back. Let's continue our stream 3 on incident response. We are going to continue talking and discussing things about ransomware. In this particular case, there's going to be a little bit of a different approach. Tom Hall is going to talk to us about the benefits of purple teaming to prevent ransomware attacks. I'll leave you with it. Enjoy the talk.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the talks at PressCon so far. Today, I'm going to walk you through purple teaming and how this can help prepare an organization for ransomware breaches. So, a little bit about me. My name's Tom. I'm the head of Blue Team at 6.6. I look after the incident response, cyber defense, and threat intelligence teams here. Prior to this, I spent about 6 years at Mandiant, working in the incident response team, kind of responding to some of the largest breaches you'd see kind of globally across the globe. And my background really before that is in digital forensics and incident response. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about with you today. We're going to walk through history of ransomware, so how ransomware operations have evolved, and how the operators have matured and the models that they use have changed across the kind of previous sort of 4 years that we've seen real major change. We're going to look at what purple teaming is, how we define it, why we use it, particularly for kind of ransomware type simulations. We'll talk to kind of threat intelligence, how we use the MITRE attack framework effectively, how we use these within purple teams to set up scenarios. How we look at running a purple team, so effectively working across both the red and blue teams together. How we use this then to deliver kind of effective results for an organization. And looking at uplifting capabilities, so on the back of the purple team engagements, how we take the findings, and we use that to create new use cases and uplift detection capabilities within the security frameworks we have. And then finally, kind of we'll go through and recap all of that and why purple teaming is effective, particularly for ransomware intrusions, and how we prepare an organization for the inevitable breaches that we're all seeing in the news. So just to start, kind of an overview of kind of the history of ransomware. So I guess it's important to touch on kind of how it's changed and what the tooling looks like and the methodologies used by ransomware operators. So traditionally, as you can see on the top left, you'd have self-propagating malware. So ransomware that's effectively worm-like in its behavior. If you think to NotPetya, WannaCry, effectively an attacker would launch this and it would propagate itself across an environment and even cross into other organizations. Not very effective if you're trying to make financial gains from this approach. But a lot of the operators moved to a manual detonation. So they effectively had to be within the environment, sending commands and launching the payloads to target specific systems and particular environments that make the most impact and increase their chance of payout. And there's two real camps that this fell into. You have spray and pray campaigns. So attackers spreading to as many organizations as possible in the hopes that some of them pay out. But a lot of them may not, and they may just take them offline. Again, when you're looking at kind of resource effectiveness, this isn't really the best methodology for anybody to use. So a lot of the operators move to a targeted deployment style of attacks. And it's very similar to what you see with nation-state attackers, red team engagements, and other sophisticated threat actors. And there are two real kind of spheres within this. You have the partnership or affiliate-based models. This is the ransomware as a service that you'll hear spoken about, like REvil, where a platform is provided for affiliates to target organizations, launch payloads, and deal with negotiations. And then you have self-managed, so the lone wolf type intruders who effectively from end to end of the life cycle will infiltrate an organization, launch the payloads, and then deal with the ransom demands themselves. One of the terms that you see kind of often thrown around in security is this saying that defenders need to succeed every time and attackers only need to succeed once. But it's a fallacy, really, and it doesn't really make sense when you apply it to a security context. That is that it relies on the assumption that attackers getting into your environment is the real end goal for them, which just isn't the case. And there's a whole ream of steps that attackers need to take in order to compromise you and your environment. And as we'll see, there are many ways that you can detect and prevent that. When we look at the kind of attack life cycles, so either the FireEye attack life cycle or the MITRE attack tactics, you can see that throughout the compromise life cycle, from initially reconnaissing your environment, so doing kind of social engineering or OSINT on the perimeter, to compromise, which may be phishing or leveraging kind of edge devices to compromise and get into your environment. There's a number of steps that they have to take really to get to a point of what their actual mission is. They have to have some form of persistence. They have to go from being a normal user to a power user. They have to perform recon within the environment to understand where the crown jewels are and what's really important to you and your organization. All of these steps are detectable. That's really good for us as a security organization, because what that actually means is you can detect all of these phases, and you can understand where the attacker is in your environment, and you can find ways to stop them. And the end goal really, which is for the attackers to effectively steal data or encrypt your systems, becomes preventable. And as we get better at detecting the attackers through this life cycle, we can pull this preventable left, right, and we can stop them from accessing numbers of our systems, and we can reduce the time it takes them to compromise you and encrypt your systems. So what is purple teaming? Well, effectively, if we break it into its constituent parts, it's a combination of both the red and the blue team. So in this instance, the red team would be the team that's effectively put out to simulate threat actor behaviors. So this is typically a scenario-based exercise where you may have a goal to steal data within the environment. And you go through a number of steps using tools and techniques that threat actors would use. And the aim really is to not be detected by the security organization. You then have the blue teams. This is the team that's then responsible for detecting this type of activity and other malicious threat actors within the environment. And the purple team really is just an engagement that combines these two teams and their expertise. So taking the tools used by the red team, programmatically running through stages of the attack lifecycle in order to determine what you can or can't detect and uplift capabilities. One of the questions that I see asked by a lot of organizations really is, am I ready for purple teaming? And is it effective for me? Well, if we look at kind of a very broad and rough maturity scale, right, going from fairly low maturity through to high maturity, what we see organizations doing at the start of their journey is to look at kind of automated vulnerability assessments. So this would be kind of Nessus scans, and similar to this, where you're looking to see what vulnerabilities are within your environment and what needs to be patched, right? As you move along this chain, you may then bring in penetration testers. So again, using similar tools and techniques, but effectively looking to see if any of your systems can be compromised. But it's very much an approach based on system and applications. The next then kind of logical step is to then bring in red teams. The problem you have with this, though, is that it requires a fairly high maturity for an organization to have it really be effective for them. And the reason for this is effectively you're simulating an advanced threat actor. And if you're not a mature organization that has a good technology stack and good processes, the likelihood is you're not going to detect any of this activity, and it's not really going to be beneficial for you. So where purple teaming comes in and where it's really useful for an organization is to bridge this gap. So it's using the same techniques that the red team will use, but it's a programmatic approach of testing you against various stages of the life cycle alongside the blue team, so that then you can really understand where you're missing detection gaps, what technologies you may need to bring in-house, and what use cases you might need to build. And it's really important because the reality is the organizations that are most affected by ransomware sit within the middle to the lower end of this maturity scale. So any steps that an organization can do to improve this is really going to help prevent ransomware breaches from happening. So bringing it together then and running a purple team, what does that look like? Well, there's a couple of stages to how a purple team works and what you would do within that team. So the first is looking at threat intelligence mapping. So taking information about threat actors, the techniques and tools that they use, understanding that, compiling that together to build out scenarios. So the scenarios could be anything from understanding ways that you would be attacked via phishing, how attackers move laterally within the environment, how they maintain persistence, and building a comprehensive set of scenarios that's derived from real world information about those threat actors to determine whether or not you as an organization would actually be capable of preventing this. The implementation stage then is the working of the red and blue team together, running the scenarios, checking kind of the logs within systems, looking at kind of your security stack, whether that's SIEM or EDR, whatever it is, to see where you are detecting things as it's being run. And then finally moving to capability uplift. So what's really important to us then is obviously identifying those gaps and detections and then building on them from the learning of the purple team. So then looking at a start, right? So attack path mapping. It's really important to take a number of different sources when you're building any kind of attack path. And there's a couple of reasons for this, mainly in that you have a lot of bias of providers depending on what they see. So some of the ways that you can build this up, you have open source reporting. So as you can see here, we have reports from Microsoft and FireEye, blogging about threat actors, particularly within ransomware in this case, with the tools and techniques that they use. You have third-party paid-for feeds, so threat intelligence feeds that go above and beyond this level of information to give you additional indicators. If you perform incident response and you have data captured for that, that's great, pull that into it as well. And there's also vendors out there who will provide this level of information for you using a range of feeds that they have. And what we're effectively trying to do is map these into MITRE ATT&CK techniques, so understanding what techniques the threat actors are using across all of the different ransomware groups. And MITRE is great, right? But there are a few caveats to be aware of, and that you should know when you're looking to do any of these mapping tasks. But you should understand that not all techniques are captured by the MITRE framework. So the reality is it's kind of a not-for-profit organization. There's new techniques that come to light. Not all of them make it into the framework straight away. And some of them will be captured under higher level headings, which can make it difficult really to understand how to map them. You need to understand whether or not these techniques are applicable to your environment, right? Is it talking about cloud infrastructure? Is it talking about maybe Mac systems that you don't have? Really understanding what the threat actors are doing, but also how it affects you and your organization. And then really to understand that bias. So the techniques that are reported on are only what's seen within breaches. This means that these are the tools that attackers have been seen using. Doesn't mean that they're all of the tools within the toolbox. So it's important to understand for us that the reality is that there are other techniques that they could be leveraging when they attack you. So building a broad range of scenarios is really important. A good example of this is credential dumping, as you can see here. MITRE talks about LSAS memory, NTDS, DC sync, cache credentials. There's a range of high-level techniques, but there's a number of different ways that any threat actor can implement in order to get access to these credentials using these methods. So what we need to do then is to map out these techniques and then translate those techniques into tests. So as you can see here as an example for credential dumping, we have a number of different tests that we would run, looking at how we can extract memory from LSAS, for instance, but using a variety of different tools and methodology, whether on system or off system, really to understand the broadest level of coverage that we have within the environment. And here within the other slides in the deck, we'll be using Vector just as an overview to give you an idea of what you can do with purple teaming and how to report on it. It's an open source project and it's really easy to get started with. So we know then we have now our mapping, right? So we know broadly the techniques that are used and we're starting to build out our tests. So this then starts to move into kind of an attack path that's testable for us. So as you can see here, we have an early stage of ransomware attack. We have a couple of different tests for phishing. So for here we have macro-based documents, VB scripts that are being run, zip files as attachments, moving them through the different stages to execution using things like PowerShell, execution via the command line, moving then on to credential access, credentials via Mimikatz with PowerShell, and multiple different ways to dump out LSAS, for instance, with ProcDump and other tools. And the real key is to have that broad level of understanding of what techniques the attackers will use, and making sure that we're covering all of those and not just limiting ourselves to individual tests and ticking a box to say that we're good and we've got detections, because that's not how it works in reality. So how do the red and blue teams really work together? Well, the main differentiator is that kind of collaboration. So here's an example. We have a beacon payload built with Meterpreter. The payload is within PowerShell. And typically within a red team, we'd run this. If there were no detections and it wasn't blocked, great, we'd carry on. But that's not what we're here for, and that's not why purple teaming is so effective. We run these scenarios and we look at the events. So we can see here, when it's run, payloads run, PowerShell is logging the command that was run. This is good. It means that we're running at least PowerShell version 5. If we were using earlier versions, the reality would be, like for instance for PowerShell version 2, that we wouldn't even see the command that was run. But there's more that we can do, right? We can enable script block logging, for instance, which would mean that the next stage is the payload is run, would be captured, and we can write better detection methods for this. And this, for instance, then with this base64 payload, will then move through an iterative process of decoding itself until eventually you have shellcode which is injected into memory. It's really hard just to detect and block all base64 encoded PowerShell, because some of it is actually legitimate. But what it enables us to do with that additional level of logging is to be able to say, okay, we can now see that there's some form of reflective loading occurring, and we can write better detections for that. And it's with these types of techniques and working through the teams together that we can really capture that level of information and uplift our detection capabilities. As we go through, recording everything that we're doing is really key, right? When we're running a purple team, it's all about how we can impact the organization and how we can enhance capabilities. There's no point just running tests and not logging it, right? If you want to rerun this, how do you then compare what you're doing against last time? So logging what the red team's doing, the source and destination systems, the techniques they're using, the tools they're using, the commands they've run, so we can replicate this later down the line if we want. And then for the blue team, importantly, is this detected, right? Or is it not? Do we need to make any changes to logging in order to detect it? Is it blocked? Do we have the ability to block it with the tool sets that we have? How can we block it in the future? Do we need to buy additional capabilities? It's really important to understand this, particularly as we then break it out into the wider tests. As we run through our scenario, as you can see here as an example, we have all the different techniques that we're running. So for the ransomware campaign, we've got our spear phishing test cases. So we can see here from the initial access phases, we've completed the tests. We can see what the outcome is, right? So we've blocked some, we've detected others, but not blocked them. We then need to understand why that is, dig into the details around the logs and understand how we then uplift that capability and how we enhance that in the future. We then can go through and we can really understand what our capabilities are as an organization. And the real important one, right, is how we then uplift our detection capabilities. So a few examples here, some of the common techniques that are often run. So we have, for instance, within PowerShell commands that are being run, there are requirements of detection, right? So as we spoke about, PowerShell version 5 script block logging, that really is required in order for us to capture the most detail possible so that we can then write detection rules against it. If we're using things like Sysmon or EDR logging, we can look at process creation. We can maybe forward those events to our team so we can write rule sets for that, so we can understand Who's running PowerShell commands? Maybe it's not common in your environment. Maybe it's a general user. Why should they be running PowerShell? It's going to really then feed into other pieces that we do within security around threat hunting and incident response. We might be able to see, okay, can we block these? Maybe we can't block this right now because we don't have any form of EDR solution. So maybe that's something we want to implement into the environment so that we can block this as it's being run. Really key to understanding what our capabilities are in the real world. We're looking at credential access, like you see here with LSAS memory. It can be hard to detect when somebody's accessing LSAS maliciously. So maybe you want to implement something like sysmon monitoring for executables or DLLs or any other kind of file trying to access LSAS. There's a lot of noise in there. Some programs obviously will do this as per normal kind of use cases, but really building out those detections and then fine-tune them later down the line can help you and effectively identify where within that attack lifecycle you're falling down. You can mitigate this, right? So maybe we can't block it because it's accessing LSAS is illegitimate for a lot of tools, but wdigest, for instance, is a registry setting within Windows, which effectively limits whether or not passwords are stored in plain text in memory. We can use this as a hunting rule to identify what systems have this enabled or don't. We can put GPO rules in place, right? So maybe on a periodic basis, we push out a GPO rule to say that we switch this off, just in case it's been turned on by any application by mistake or breaching policy. One of the ones we see quite often, particularly with ransomware operators, is group policy modifications. So we can do hunting techniques for this. When you create a GPO rule on the domain controller, the script is then saved down to a sysvol location. So that's an environment variable stored typically within the system drive of the domain controller. What scripts have appeared recently? Are they legitimate? Should they be there or not? We can do detections within event logs, right? So we can see, okay, well, have GPO rules being created? We're logging for them. Maybe this isn't standard practice, that's all the time. We might not be able to block it, but we can at least then understand how we might be able to detect this better, particularly when we're looking at the perspective of ransomware operators and how they work. And then finally, how do we then understand where an organization is failing or not? Well, the final reporting really is really key, and it helps to map it out against the MITRE framework. So as you can see here in this example, we've got a traffic light system for different techniques. It's really good because as an organization, we can say, okay, how have we succeeded? How have we failed? What do we need to implement? Are there any key techniques that we failed on? Maybe some of them aren't as important to detect on or even to block on. But it's really, really good, and it's helpful to then present to senior stakeholders, particularly where you're talking about budget spends. So maybe you spent a lot of money on tooling and you want to justify that, and this can really help you kind of get that level of detail across as to where that's put the most effectiveness on your detection capabilities. Or maybe you need to find a use case to bring in EDR. These can be really kind of visually impactful to people, particularly if they're not technical. And then finally, pulling it all together and why purple teaming helps, and particularly why it matters in the sphere of ransomware. So the reality is ransomware is not going anywhere, right? I've lost track of the amount of talks I and others have done over the years on how ransomware is becoming even more of a problem, and I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. It's a massive cost of business, financially, but also reputationally, right? Lots of organizations do come back for this, but others don't, right? And there are organizations that go under because of this. There is some part to play by government. The problem I find with this is that the focus ends up being on payment. And that's great, but it doesn't help organizations protect themselves. Outlawing payment doesn't help the CFO who has to explain to his shareholders why the stock price has gone down because of this. And takedowns, so most recently, like we saw with the Ukrainian police taking down some of the COP operators, within a couple of days of this happening, new victims were being released by them. So it doesn't really have too much of an impact. So really it's within organizations to empower themselves and to use services like Purple Teams to really uplift their capabilities, particularly for ransomware, where we know so much about the operators and how they work, and so much is shared between them in terms of capability that it really is as simple as understanding where your gaps are in detections and how to fill those gaps. And I think bang for buck, services like Purple Teams will really help an organization uplift their security maturity and help prevent getting to the point where we have to be discussing payments. Thanks for listening. That was my talk. Hopefully you found it useful. If you need anything or want to ask me any further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was a very interesting talk. If anyone has any questions, please send them across to the application, and I will discuss them with Tom. Maybe to start with, Tom, what we could discuss is how do you see Purple Team initiatives and how the trends of ransomware could potentially can have an effect in how the trends that you see in ransomware initiatives like Purple Teaming?
Yeah, so I think the reality is that we're not going to see a reduction in ransomware operations. I think there's a lot of good organizations at the moment kind of collaborating with kind of governments to look at how we clamp down on things like payments. We're seeing local kind of police forces and other organizations making arrests and or probably see some indictments coming up. But the reality is it's so easy still for organizations to be hit by threat actors, particularly kind of from kind of the ransomware as a service organizations who are pretty prolific. And I just think that there's going to be no meaningful reduction in these types of intrusions over the next few years. It may be that we have some political leverage over the likes of kind of the Russian state to clamp down on them, but organizations are still going to be suffering from this. So I think it's important for organizations to take control of their own risk and to understand how they protect themselves. Like kind of because as I touched on, we know from open source reporting by threat intelligence providers and incident response firms how these actors operate. We know what techniques and tools they use, and we can use exercises like Purple Teaming to really effectively understand where our weaknesses are within an organization, and then we can focus on how to plug those holes.
Very good. We don't seem to have any questions on our system. Let me ask you another thing. Clearly, technology is evolving very, very quickly. The visibility with EDRs, et cetera, is increasing. So techniques used just a year ago, like use of PowerShell, or a couple of years ago, use of PowerShell, now they are very well understood, very well picked up. And attackers are evolving at all times. How do you see Purple Teamers as well keep coping with this really, really fast change in the landscape?
Yeah, and that's why it's important to have the threat intelligence portion of these exercises so that you're continuously updating how you approach it and the techniques that you're mapping to. I think for organizations, the real issue is there's years of underspend in IT and in security. And it's a two-tandem effect, right? You can have the largest security budget in the world, but if you're running devices like Windows Server 2003 that are running domain controllers, and you have kind of unpatched systems on the perimeter, you're never going to be able to protect yourself. So it's balancing kind of that spend. And unfortunately, lots of organizations don't have tools like EDR and other things that allow you to detect this. So I think these types of exercises are really important to help bring organizations along, because the reality is it's the lower maturity organizations who are being targeted by this and are being hit by this. And there's unfortunately a lot of organizations with large turnover globally who operate on pretty old infrastructure.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very good. Let me remind everyone, if there's any questions, please send them across. You touched on threat intelligence, and someone may argue that threat intelligence would only be as good as the incidents which have been detected, which arguably would not be the best ones. So therefore, there's some people who think that this is a cat and mouse race, and always the cat is going to be the bigger one, right? What do you think about threat intelligence potentially not being able to tell us exactly what the latest threats or attacks are, precisely because only the unsuccessful ones or the detected ones are part of that intelligence?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So first of all, when you're looking at any threat intelligence, it's important to diversify your sources. So it's all well and good purchasing a threat intelligence feed from a major provider and just using that, and you'll get some really good understanding of threat actor behaviors from that. But if you're only looking at one feed and you're not combining kind of open source reporting, other commercial feeds, maybe information sharing groups within your particular line, right? So if you're financial services, if it's FS-ISAC or something like that allows you to share amongst peers, you're always going to be having gaps because all threat intelligence providers will have some form of bias. Now, you're right. That's going to give you an understanding of what's been seen. You're never going to be able to play on that, right? So if you think back recently to kind of the CVEs we saw, the exchange, nobody could have told you that threat actors are going to have a CVE. And within 2 days, you're going to see ransomware operators using that against organizations that are unpatched. But that's really where it's important to understand that defending across that entire life cycle is what helps you, because you're never going to be able to get to a point where you stop yourself being breached by an actor. But you can reduce the time it takes you to detect them. And if you think about typically, a red team might take 2 days to get to main admin. If you can detect that activity within a matter of days rather than weeks, because you've used things like purple teams to secure up the detections internally, you're going to prevent them from completing the end goal.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. There's no questions in our application. Let me say thank you again for the talk. Thanks a lot. We have 20 minutes gap, and we will be back with Luke Price and Sean O'Connor. They are going to talk about the transition between SOC and incident response. We will see you very soon. Bye for now. Thank you, Tom.